Today, we're discussing critical race theory and the censorship of Black history. It's hard to know where to begin with critical race theory. The concept has taken on a bunch of excess baggage.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory. Critical race theory.
The radical left, the socialist Marxists, and the critical race theorists.
Ever since the right-wing culture war started at the end of the Trump administration, it's now being banned all across the country in state legislatures, which are seeking to limit how we discuss race in the classroom, seeking to ban and censor Black history. Tyler, what would you say critical race theory is, and how is it being misrepresented?
Well, traditionally, critical race theory is sort of a legal framework for understanding how race exists, not just in individual bias, but systemically in legal and economic systems. Today, and in the past couple of years, critical race theory, as you said, has taken on a lot of extra meaning. It is a culture war that fuels a far more sinister and underrepresented project undertaken by the right-wing party.
We're not really doing an explainer on what is critical race theory. There's a lot of really great videos out there. What we're trying to do is highlight what are the real stakes of this culture war? What are the material stakes of this culture war? How does this discourse impact our lives and our struggles for emancipation? The word culture war doesn't do it justice because the stakes are incredibly real. What do you think those stakes are, and how can we, get into that?
There's plenty of private interests, right-wing lobbying, a lot of polling, and a lot of investment in basically what sort of terminology, what sort of rhetoric will properly get people interested, invested in voting for a platform that serves their interests. But people are voting for critical race theory. But what they're really voting for is a privatization of education, an erasure of public space, further segregation of working class folk. I think it just continues to demonstrate the point that actual critical race theory makes, which is race is profitable.
To piggyback on that, there is a real push to attack the public sphere and our capacity to have discourse around systemic racism. Privatization is a tool of segregation. Economic inequality is one of the ways in which white supremacy has continued to proliferate in the 21st century and in the modern era. This effort to destroy and censor Black history is directly connected to this privatization effort.
And this is the exact conversation that's not being had, not being channeled through the culture war that is critical race theory. The culture war of critical race theory relies on a misinterpretation, and that's what we hope to correct.
We want to advance a pro-critical race theory argument in addition to highlighting the insufficiencies of the right-wing interpretation of critical race theory and the liberal response to the right-wing culture war.
I think we should get into how exactly conservative folk, white folk, are interpreting critical race theory. What is their definition of critical race theory? Let's go into the specifics. Like, what are some of the terms that are used by right-wing folk? Anti-American, or perhaps anti-white, communist even. Critical race theory, or their interpretation of it, it seems to be this container to hold every single right-wing fear or threat.
Our public schools have been taken over by the radical left maniacs. Here is my plan to save American education, restore power to American parents. First, we will cut federal funding for any school or program pushing critical race theory, gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content onto our children. And at the end of the day, if we have pink-haired communists teaching our kids, we have a major problem.
I wanted to start this off by saying that there is something tremendously psychoanalytic about the ways in which the right wing is attacking critical race theory, quote unquote. Critical race theory is, in many ways, the right wing object, this object of desire and of, if anything, it's an object of hatred, where they can put everything that they don't like about education, the current racial discourse, into one object. They pretty much stated so explicitly, that they're trying to label anything that they don't like that's being discussed about race is critical race theory and trying to ban it.
I like that you identified as fantasy, because the way fantasy operates is by a staging of desire.
I think you can really see the staging and how they seek to highlight or cherry pick examples of maybe sloppy or out of context examples of diversity and equity in schools, labeling it as anti-white hatred or as anti-patriotic. I think one thing that I find tremendously fascinating about the right-wing discourse is their failure to think systemically. They have an inability to conceptualize systems, particularly systems which have enormously advantaged them as a group, sort of very unconscious in that way of, I can't see the thing that I benefit from or draw some sort of pleasure from.
That would be called disavowal, right?
This disavowal, yes, at the core of their understanding. But they seem to intensely personalize collective history.
Maybe the simplest or most blunt explanation is that they've been brainwashed by capital to think as individuals, right? Or as like these completely isolated islands. They obviously deny the basic tenets of critical race theory, even though they don't understand it, that they'd much rather interpret race as existing within individuals. It could also be identified as like classic color blindness, but it goes a step further in calling any discussion about race itself racist. And I think that speaks particularly to this sort of perverse disavowal or almost a position of perverseness that you would see often in like QAnon or edgy far right groups. But I think a lot of people fail to see how much of a fantasy and how detached from reality this critical race theory really is.
Well, I think that fantasy is the right word, because I think when you disarticulate the fantasy and you propose straightforwardly what the Republicans want to do to our public education system, it's tremendously unpopular. People do not want to see books banned. They don't want to see history censored. And they don't want education to be privatized. Those are all things that if you just run on those are tremendously unpopular. But through this fantasy of critical race theory and the stoking of this white paranoia and fear, they're able to mobilize people against the best interest of the public.
Right. I think you're touching on, I think, the next question we need to ask, which is what narratives, what conditions have contributed to this effervescence of political energy?
Well, it's a really complex set of phenomena that have come together. There are cultural aspects of it that I really want to touch on, and there are material conditions that are also important to mention. On the level of culture, there has been a shift in the historical narratives that the right has historically relied upon to justify their political, social, and economic positions. Critical race theory is incompatible with right-wing nationalism, and right-wing nationalism seeks discursive control over our nation's history. It cannot exist with counter-narratives.
You already mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, but you can also point out non-white and non-cis representation in media, basically mainstream now. Twitter itself contributes a lot to a fueling of culture war and politics based purely off identity. Not only that, but that in conjunction with the Trump presidency and his style of politics, his rhetoric, his sort of injunction to enjoy beyond the normal morals of political enjoyment.
I think, too, that there's this inability to confront the real systemic inequalities that exist today. That a disproportionate number of African Americans are incarcerated, are impoverished, navigating these systems that are biased against them.
Yeah, and it's not a matter of knowledge, right? I mean, like, the knowledge is out there. By seeking privatization of public goods and public services, I think they seek to continue to shelter themselves from the material realities that sustain their ideologies. And it seems as though their utopia would be to create this like gated community where they can privatize everything, essentially, where they can choose to isolate themselves from the realities, the negative externalities of capital, like a regression to segregation through privatization.
Back when it was possible to do it with Jim Crow, they did it with Jim Crow. But now they can do it with just pure economics and, previously existing inequalities. That's how they'll navigate. I think that there's a psychosocial dimension to it. It's not purely materialist and it's not purely cultural psychosocial, but there's a dialectical synthesis of these two phenomena. People have material interest, but all material interests are mediated by their perceptions of them.
Now what we should get into is an interpretation of the liberal take on CRT and its inefficiencies, maybe even where it's right sometimes.
I think that the insufficiency in the liberal take comes from how they tend to engage with the right-wing proliferation of this culture war, and they tend to engage using the sort of discursive terms of the right wing. I think they also, are stuck within that conservative framework by refusing to connect this attack on critical race theory with a broader systemic issue of material inequality and systemic racism and oppression. Liberals have really moralized the banning of critical race theory and centered the voices of white conservatives, concerned conservative parents, and political leaders such as Ron DeSantis and Christopher Rufo, and have limited the debate to a consumer choice for parents on their kids' education, when it's really about the public sphere, the future of democracy, and about, our ability to continue the struggle for emancipation.
So critical race theory is, it started as a legal perspective in examining the law, but it really doesn't have much to do with history. It is basically related in the way that if you teach Microsoft Word to a classroom, you're not teaching them computer engineering, even though they're using a computer.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I just want to sum it up with the failure of the liberal interpretation, the liberal framework is the same consistent failure, which is a co-opting or a ceding ground to right-wing arguments and ideology. Right-wing folks are always laying the framework, the terms of the discussion, and liberals never take it into their own hands and always simply meet them where they're at. I think this is a perfect opportunity for a proper critique of American education. I mean, it's like at least a decade lagging behind of the current social and technological complexity of our society. Anyone graduating from high school is totally ill-equipped to deal with not only just getting a job, but just functioning.
No, I think we need a radical revisioning of education and pedagogy that would equip people for the modern world. And I think that's a huge issue that we're seeing. A lot of folks are coming out of high school with an insufficient level of education to sort of navigate the complex social, political, economic structures that exist today.
Our point here is that the crisis around critical race theory, yes, is a culture war, but race is material. And there is a lot of race manufacturing, race building going on here behind the scenes, and a lot of profit to be made. So I think what we want to end on is just some clear points on how race has been manufactured to the benefit of capital and how they in turn reproduce one another. I think these are the most important points to maybe take home and really set your priorities straight,
Yeah, I want to take that further. Like when we say that race is material, we're saying that race is economic, it's political, and has been since slavery, since chattel slavery, and the invention of race, which is that sort of first instance of racism, of producing a racial caste system in order to divide slave labor from other forms of labor.
Well, you've perfectly described the sort of originating conditions of race, but critical race theory sort of deals with the post-civil rights era, right? And a lot of white folk, right-wing folk would like to argue that race is gone, doesn't exist. But I think a lot of critical race theory advocates would argue that that's where the discussion needs to begin, where race really starts to side with capital in new and interesting ways.
Race has always been institutional and systemic. It was institutional and systemic before it was individual. And then as we continued post-Civil War, there was, all sorts of institutions and systems built around race and infrastructure and how cities were created and how land was distributed and how labor was exploited. And then in this post-civil rights era, a lot of the big questions that critical race theory tries to answer is, why wasn't 1968 the end of racism? Why, with the end of de facto segregation, do we still see so much institutional racism? And it's a really important question. The answer to which, I think, is largely capitalism.
You got to freeze capitalism, Nixon! Freeze capitalism! That's the problem!
If you go to any city of any size in this country, that there is an area that, has been segregated or cut off resource-wise, that is the black area, that is underfunded, under-resourced, criminalized, attacked, where poverty is left to run rife.
Because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact.
Yeah, I think city settings are the perfect example or perfect case study for showing exactly how capital and racism work together. I mean, like you were saying, there's this process of generating value from property by exploiting people, by pushing people off into the margins of any given city, and then returning to gentrify it in this sort of cycle of alienation, of producing race in order to generate an immense amount of wealth. And so gentrification is an ongoing, not only profitable venture, but an ongoing production of race. Mass incarceration is another example, where when people see that Black people are disproportionately incarcerated, that sort of reproduces or justifies this ideological bias that argues Black people are inherently criminal.
Critical race theory provides us really strong answers for understanding that. Racism is producing an exploitable, impoverished class, which is necessary for capital and capitalism to operate. They need people in the prisons, they need low-wage workers willing to accept exploitative, low-wage positions, and they need people to sort of do the work that keeps capitalism functioning.
One also mentioned drain pool politics as another perfect example of post-civil rights race.
Then manager James Brock told them to get off his private property, tossed cleaning chemicals inside the pool in an effort to get the Negroes to leave.
I think you explained the story really well, Nick, if you want to describe it.
Yeah, drain pool politics is a concept that's used to talk about post-civil rights politics, in which white communities, rather than desegregating institutions or areas, would simply exit. Instead of having a public pool available to Black and white children, would rather drain a pool and have an empty pool. As schools were desegregating, there was this push to privatize education. And so all across the South and in the North, white students were increasingly leaving public schools for private schools with state vouchers in order to avoid the desegregated public schools.
The same process of draining a pool can apply to the draining of resources from a school or a public school.
Yeah, and it's the same thing that's going on now, of underfund the mixed racial public schools, claim that they're failing, and encourage people to go to the privatized system. And it's the same thing in public housing, that as public housing was desegregated, it was systematically underfunded once Black people had the same access to public housing as white people. This is how whiteness is used against the interest of working class white people and for the benefit, let's be clear, of the wealthy white people.
Yeah. The connection we're trying to draw here is that privatization is antithetical to public space, and we consider public space to be the foundation for any sort of leftist project, working class project, any encroachment or privatization will usually mean a division, an inability to talk amongst ourselves. And in this case, the production of race, which is exactly that, a division between folks who really disavow their common alienation.
Popular capitalism is nothing less than a crusade to enfranchise the many in the economic life of the nation. We conservatives are returning power to the people. That is the way to one nation, one people.
I think one thing you really touched on there was that privatization is an excellent way to preserve these racial, socioeconomic hierarchies. Within the private domain, there's a lot more individual autonomy to engage with this privilege, whereas in the public space, maintaining inequality and maintaining hierarchy is more difficult. The publics tend to be a more fertile ground for equality and an excellent places to struggle for equality, you know.
I think what we're seeing with CRT is capital will support this right-wing endeavor right alongside supporting pro-LGBTQ events or movements, trying to cater to both right-wing and liberal ideologies. I wouldn't call them left-wing, and running into all sorts of contradictions, particularly from the right, especially as it begins to liberalize media and other sort of markets. But there's definitely a crisis that I think critical race theory is really only the beginning of.
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, at the core of this critical race theory crisis is this material contradiction of race, that there is still so much inequality and oppression and violence, and that regardless of what they do to suppress Black history, we will continue to teach it. You know, we won't be silenced, we're not going away, and we're not going to stop fighting to change our material conditions. You know, I think we should conclude by saying that the struggle will continue, and that we encourage y'all to be active participants in it. And that means, you know, teaching Black history, teaching radical Black history, making these connections between capitalism and racism, and, you know, being systemic in our critiques of institutions.
Exactly. Not meeting them where they're at, but elevating the conversation.
Let's go out and win this culture war, folks. If you liked this video, please check out some of our other videos. We did a great video on the genealogy of policing and why the police can't be reformed.
Good complimentary video.
It's an excellent sort of, if you're looking for more of this content and you want to see more, we do a great deep dive into the police. We do a good job, you know, highlighting looting in the George Floyd protest, if you're interested in that. Definitely subscribe to the channel. We're going to be coming out with a lot more content. We got some really exciting videos coming up ahead, so stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Peace.